the goal going into next year is to get at least 10 builds done next year. And with him, should be netting, I mean, somewhere between 80 to 100 per build each.
Welcome back to the Money Seed Podcast. My guest today is Dan Haberkost. Dan is the CEO of Front Range Land. Dan started his real estate journey at age 16 and was well on his way to financial independence by age 25. He's got a fantastic story. I can't wait to get into the details. Dan, welcome to the show.
Gabe, thanks for having me. Excited to talk a bit about investing, land, rentals, and everything in between.
Let's do it. Dan, it's not often I meet someone who started their real estate investment journey at 16. How on earth did you get into real estate at age 16?
16 was when I was working for somebody else, and I managed a farm, and then the owner of that farm also owned a rental portfolio, and he spent most of his year in Aruba. As I mentioned before we started recording, I grew up in Ohio, and the weather's pretty much awful there all the time, but especially in the winter. And so he would leave me in charge of both the farm and his rental properties while he would go down south to Aruba. And that, interestingly enough, it didn't motivate me to want to get into investing, partially because I was not thinking about that at the time, but also because he owned, C minus, D plus properties, had a very confrontational dynamic with his tenants. I'll never forget, I was 16 and I was ripping up a feces covered carpet. It was some sort of cat. I don't know what they had. It was some sort of, not cat, ferret or they had some weird pet. The carpet was covered in, I was ripping this up on a hot, humid Ohio summer day. And then a year later, I'm 17. I remember this so vividly. He had another tenant go through, trash it. He had placed, I did not place that one, either of them. And I had to deal with the remnants of that. And so that taught me in hindsight all about the type of real estate I did not want to own. So I did that through high school and college. I had a couple miscellaneous jobs my first couple years while I was going to school. And then the last 2 years, I was managing a landscaping business, working full-time, going to school full-time. And it was around 20 years old that I was a little frustrated. I had been running other people's businesses for years, went to school full-time, and it was great because I paid for it as I went, but didn't have a whole lot of fun in college. Definitely didn't have a normal college experience. But I thought, okay, I know I'm a little bit precocious. I've been managing, these people's businesses for years. I can certainly take this experience and go start something of my own. So I started reading different books. And like everybody else, when I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, it was like light bulb went off. And so real estate it is. And shortly thereafter, I bought a duplex. I was 21 at the time. I still own that today. It's in Parma, Ohio. That was my first ever deal, and it was just a simple house hack. I bought it, I think FHA, 3.5% down, lived in one side, rented out the other. Shortly after, ended up moving to Colorado, didn't want to stay in Ohio, bought another house hack, and around that time, I realized that the low and no money down stuff is great for selling courses and podcasts, but the reality is if you want to accrue a significant rental portfolio, this is a cash-intensive venture because I bought a rental at 3% owner carry, 3% interest, owner carry, no money down. But you still need cash, even if you want to do deals like that, or your partner does, because things are going to go wrong. So anyways, around that time, when I moved out here, there's a long story, but I met a guy at my local real estate group, which I actually host now, who had been doing land and development all over the country for the last 40-some years. We became friends. I would help him in his business. I drive an hour south every weekend to go help him find land for the new builds, just help him with the new builds. And that's where Front Range Land ultimately came from, which is my active business. It's all just land and development, and then that feeds the continual acquisition of more rental properties.
I love that story, right? It sounds like you got into house hacking, where if you had a duplex, I imagine you were living in one half, renting out the other.
Initially, yep.
That's perfect. So this was probably cash flow positive from day one, especially if you consider your own rent as well.
Yes, if I were to consider my own rent, that house, duplex would have been. But I'll tell you what really moved the needle for me and allowed me to quit my job. So when I moved out here, I bought a house. It was a 4-bed, 3-bath. So this is the second property I ever bought. I was 22. And I lived in the master. I rented out the basement as its own little unit for $900 a month. 2 extra bedrooms upstairs for $700 a piece. And my mortgage at the time was, I think because I refied, so I forget what it was originally. I think it was $1,600 a month originally, and so I had $2,300 a month coming in on a $1,600 a month mortgage while I was living in that house. So it also paid my utilities, gas, and food every month at the time, and that really gave me a cushion to leave my job and really get my own active business going, and gave me kind of a fallback so I could go out and figure out how to make money, because it took a little while for me to figure out how to make money in my active business.
But I think that's a great example of how it really does open up a world of opportunity when you own your own house, when you start owning real
Mm-hmm.
assets, right? Because there's a lot of different ways you can make money from a house you actually live in, right? I think you just mentioned a couple of examples like house
Mm-hmm.
hacking, rent out the basement, rent out the extra rooms to, students or et cetera. Another way you can do it, I had a guest on the show recently. He actually figured out that you can rent out your home like 1 day a week or 2 days a week to like film crews, like somebody who's shooting a
Mm-hmm.
TV commercial or something. You don't even have to be there. They show up at 6 a.m., they leave at 5 p.m., and you can get like $1,000 a day for your house. Like, wow, that's pretty
Oh,
amazing. Um,
interesting.
People who host international students, right? Okay, yeah, you have
Mm-hmm.
to cook, 2 meals a day for the student and sometimes show up to the high school and talk to the principal when the kids gets in trouble. But same thing,
Mm-hmm.
like the parents will pay for room and board. Like there's so many different ways that you can start monetizing the asset you have once you get into a house. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit, what did your first business look like? You mentioned that gave you the freedom of and the money to do it.
Yeah, well, so those first couple of house hacks gave me a nice foundation. So I was able to leave my job as I was trying to figure out how to get front range land going. And so ultimately, what that started as was just going direct to seller, sourcing land for other builders, and then just buying and selling it to them. Sometimes assigning it to them. I haven't done maybe a dozen assignments, a couple dozen assignments, but mostly I've closed everything I've ever put under contract. And then eventually, I also started putting new builds on a portion of the lots myself.
Dan, tell us a little bit more about the business model. How does this land investing work?
Sure. So, land investing in and of itself is a massive umbrella. What I'm going to describe to you is what I do, which is only a tiny little sliver of all the different strategies with land. And so, to expand on that for your audience, I focus on infill land. And what I mean by that is lots that are shovel ready, that are horizontally developed. And so, an easy way to describe this to somebody who doesn't know anything about land is, if you go take just a farm field out in the middle of nowhere, like east of Colorado Springs, out towards Kansas, Nebraska, that's raw land. There's a huge amount of work, money, and effort that has to be put into that sort of land to get it to the point of being ready to build on. To that point, infill land is, let's say you're going down the street, you're in San Francisco and you see two houses and a vacant lot in between. That's an infill lot. That's the type of land I focus on. So I wanted to make that distinction because that's really important. So knowing that I only focus on that, think of just a giant direct to seller marketing funnel via mail and cold calling, but mostly mail, where we target that sort of land. And a lot of it we just buy and sell. See, land is interesting, especially in some of these really hot markets where it's gone up 5 or 10x, like a lot of Florida markets, in a short time. It's not that hard to buy it at a substantial discount and just resell it. So that's a great base. But then here in Colorado, because I've only done builds locally here where I can keep my eye on them, I'll put new construction on a few lots at a time. So single family, duplex, just simple spec builds. The way I learned to do that initially was all via pre-sale. And that can be a great model where, let's say, Gabe, you're a realtor, you have a client that wants a new construction home, you want to buy one of my lots. And I say, well, Gabe, I don't really want to just sell you the lot, but if your client wants, my team to put the house on it, we could put a deal together that way, and you write a contract, we sign a building agreement. Then the day that we get the CO, the certificate of occupancy for the new build, it closes the sale to the client. That's a great model. So during the pandemic, that became problematic when commodities went crazy, when lumber shot up and everything like that. But we're back to a more stable material prices. So that is a good model again. On the flip side, you can also just build on spec or speculation and then try and sell it once it's complete. So I personally like kind of a mix between the two, where once our major costs are locked in, once it's framed, then we list it and get it pre-sold then. So it still closes right when we finish, but we didn't price it until we were pretty darn close to being done and had our costs locked in. So to your initial question, it's just a simple marketing funnel going direct to seller for land, buying it anywhere from 30 to 70 cents on the dollar, depending on the deal. A lot of it just buying and selling, some on cash, some for terms, and then a few at a time putting new construction on.
You just flip the land essentially, but sometimes you actually go all the way and do the construction on top.
Yes. Yep.
Got it. And let's go back to the land for a second. How long do you typically hold the land if you just flip it?
It varies pretty dramatically. I mean, we had one we closed last week in Cape Coral. We listed on the market. It was under contract in 2 days. And then on the flip side, 15-day close. On the flip side, I have 2 closing next week in North Carolina, where I think I bought those February 1st. So that took over 6 months. So somewhere between 1 to 6 months, usually it falls closer to the 2 to 3, 60 to 90 days. So somewhere around that.
You mentioned that you live in Colorado Springs and you're familiar with the area around it, et cetera, but you just mentioned the Carolinas. I mean, how do you do this remotely?
Land, and especially infill land, is really simple. But even if it's not, because we're looking at some bigger acreage that would be a little more involved, might require some subdividing, that sort of thing. It's all about finding the local expert. This is one of the first things I teach my acquisition managers. If you find a local expert, make sure you pay them on every transaction they help you with, even if they don't end up finding the buyer for you, because they're worth their weight in gold. So I've got a realtor in Florida who has hundreds and hundreds of land listings all over Florida. If I need any data on any market in Florida, he's got it for me like that, right? So that's kind of the key, is just finding the local expert.
Amazing. So how many different markets are you in currently?
Primarily all over Florida, south of the Panhandle. It's a couple counties in North Carolina, and then sticking to just 2 counties kind of along the front range where I live here in Colorado. I had done a couple deals in New Mexico, but not planning to continue doing business down there.
What advice would you have for somebody who is just starting out in real estate? Like if they're just looking at their first ever deal, or like they just heard, hey, real estate is a great way to grow someone's wealth and someone's passive income. Like what's the first step?
Well, the first step is to get really clear on what you're trying to accomplish, because there's 2 different things. There's people who want to get out of their day job and probably need to start an active business to do that. And then, or on the flip side, there's people that like their job, they're well paid, or maybe they have another business outside of real estate that is already very profitable, and they need real estate as a way to reduce their tax liability and build wealth in the long term. So figure that out, because what I just described is this person over here needs the active day-to-day business within real estate, and then this person over here just needs investments. And so for me, Front Range Land is my active business, which solved the problem of getting me out of a job and scaling my income so I could go buy more rentals. And then the rentals are more for the long term. So that's the first thing you need to identify. If you're making, I have a buddy who's an ER doctor. He makes $500,000 a year. He likes his job. So he just invests in nice rentals on the side. Is that you? Or are you the person that hates your 9 to 5? You want to get out now? Well, if that's you, you need to start an active business first to make money and be able to invest. All right. So that's step number 1. And then from there, let's just say you want to start some sort of an active business. Well, I would go wherever you have resources. Is it necessarily that land is so interesting or unique? Well, I think it's underappreciated and less competitive, but you could go make millions of dollars flipping houses or wholesaling houses or flipping apartments or really any niche within real estate. It's that I found an expert in the area or domain of land and development who was willing to teach me. So that's really more than anything why that ended up being my active business. And then on the flip side of that, if you're the person that just wants to invest, right, you have the active business, or maybe you have a job you like, or an active business that's already making you a lot of money, then you need to pick one asset and one location and get really good at investing in that asset. Don't try and buy apartments in the Midwest and storage in California and, mobile home parks in Colorado. That's how you're going to get yourself in trouble. And on that whole note, especially because I know you're in San Francisco and I've seen this so many times, watch out for what looks good on paper but is not reality. So I'm from near Cleveland. I grew up in a cornfield in Ohio, but it wasn't that far outside of Cleveland. And so often people from California hear about these amazing cap rates you get in Cleveland. And what they don't realize is that cap rate, that pro forma will never actually come to fruition because you're buying, in a war zone. So that's just another thing for people who are trying to invest out of state. Make sure that the person on the ground or the people you're buying from, are telling you the truth about what you're buying.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, right? Always do your research, always know where you're putting your money and what you're getting yourself into. That's always good advice.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Dan, what are your goals, short-term and long-term goals with Front Range Land?
Ooh, good question. So really what I'm working on doing is, so I just transitioned the builder, because I'm not a general contractor, right? So I hire a general contractor to do these builds. The general contractor I was using fell apart. I'm so glad the last couple projects with him are off my books. And right now I have just shifted to a new one who, and so I'm answering your question here in a kind of roundabout way, but the goal going into next year is to get at least 10 builds done next year. And with him, should be netting, somewhere between 80 to 100 per build each. So that's what we're working on there. And then in my day-to-day just buying and selling of land, I'm pushing towards, slightly more sophisticated deals where, for example, we're looking at a big piece in North Carolina where it needs a simple subdivide, new survey, soils tests on the new lots, but we're going to spend probably 15 to 20 grand on those improvements, and that will double the value. So getting into deals like that where we can make, six figures or multiple six figures on one deal are really where I'm pushing towards. It's funny you asked me this. I'm actually going out of town this week to reevaluate and reestablish new goals because one other thing that I've fallen short on is I have made the mistake of consistently, I go make X amount of dollars and then I buy another deal and then I make more money and then I buy. So I have way too much of my own cash in my active business. So I've fallen behind on buy and holds. I have not bought any new buy and holds this year, and I've got to, or I'm going to get hurt come tax time. So that's another thing. I need to sit down, reevaluate, and work on using more investor money in my active business, pulling more of my own money out, and getting a few buy and holds bought by the end of the year. I have a few I'm working on, hoping to get a couple fourplexes. So we'll see.
And sorry, Dan, what do you mean exactly by buy and hold?
Oh, just actual real estate that you keep. So I buy a fourplex, I rent it out, and I keep it for the foreseeable future. That's what I mean by buy and hold.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yep.
Right now, it's a pretty interesting time in the real estate market with mortgage rates being as high as they are, the economy being uncertain. What is your personal outlook on the real estate market?
So you mentioned Florida and North Carolina, and I've been very intentional about going there because they're, at least the markets I'm in specifically within those states, are still very affordable. There are huge amounts of people flocking there. And more specifically, there are people with money going there. And so when about a year ago, I moved, because I've been doing most of my business in Colorado, I moved a lot of it to those two states, at least for the short-term stuff, because, barring some sort of World War III or Black Swan, people are going to continue to move there, and real estate's going to continue to transact, especially in the places where it's still affordable and desirable, because especially where I'm at in North Carolina, it's really pretty. It's not that hot in the summer. It's right by the ocean. And so I feel confident doing business down there where lots of people and money are going. Then here in Colorado with the new builds, I've focused on just very entry level. So the spec houses are at $350 to $400K. And in Colorado, to get a new home for that price is very cheap. And the duplexes we're building, they cash flow, right? And so there's plenty of buyers for that sort of product. So to summarize, I'm just focusing on entry level, right? I'm not trying to go sell $1 million spec homes, and focusing on markets where lots of people and money are going.
Amazing. How busy are you? How many hours a week would you say you spend on your businesses?
That's a hard question because I spend a lot of time, in meetings and working where a lot of my friends are also in business. And if we're going and playing basketball and talking business, does that work? So probably, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 30 an hour, 20 to 30 hours, but it totally depends. What really matters to me is that I'm prioritizing the things that I want to prioritize. So next week I'm going to San Diego with a bunch of friends. And I'm not really going to work for a week, but I'll be excited about work when I come back, and I'll probably work through the weekend when I come back. So it's kind of arbitrary and all over the place, just depending on what projects I'm doing and what I'm excited about.
Dan, I love your story. Where can people reach out to you to learn more, and where can people learn more about Front Range Land?
So danhaberkost.com or on any of the socials. And then at the same time, started a podcast with a fellow land investor talking all things real estate and business, The Big Picture Blueprint. That one is on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube. You can find it anywhere.
Awesome. I will put those links into the show notes. Dan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Gabe.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Money Seed Podcast. Please remember to click like and subscribe. It really helps spread the message to other investors, and it helps attract new viewers to the show. We appreciate your support. Thanks very much.